The warmest of welcomes to our latest Nesta Talks to event. This is a regular series where we have conversations with some of the most interesting thinkers and doers out there. My name is Celia Hannon. I'm director of Nesta's Discovery Hub. Our team is really all about surfacing hidden trends. We also think hard about how to build cultures and teams which are not just capable of generating novel ideas, but also able to absorb them and then act on them. And because of our day jobs in the Discovery Hub, I'm especially looking forward to hearing from Dr Christian Busch as he unpacks the role of uncertainty in innovation. But before I introduce Christian properly, inevitably there are some quick points of housekeeping. You can access closed captions for this event via the LinkedIn live stream. I want to urge you to join the conversation in the comments box on the right-hand side of your screen. Ask your questions throughout the presentation that Christian is going to give. They won't be disappearing into the ether. I'll be capturing them, and I promise to exercise some discipline and make sure we have time at the end for Christian to respond. So now on to today's speaker. Christian teaches at the LSE and at New York University. In fact, I think he's joining us bright and early from New York today. Thank you for that, Christian. Previously, Christian was a co-founder of Leaders on Purpose and the Sandbox Network. He was also co-director of LSE's Innovation Lab. As you can probably tell from the bio, Christian knows his way around a lab, a network, or a sandbox, but he's complemented that experience in applied innovation with a decade of research into whether there is such a thing as smart luck. All of that led to the book Christian is here to talk to us about. In it, I very much enjoyed learning that the technical term for connecting the dots is by association. So thanks for that piece of trivia, Christian, and I look forward to hearing more nuggets in your talk. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Celia. It's wonderful to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll take you on a journey of exploring how we can create this kind of smart luck, both in our own lives, but also in our organizations, and then more broadly in society. To give you a bit of context, I grew up in Heidelberg in Germany. I used to be that kind of kid who was kicked out of high school, had to repeat a year, probably held the unofficial world record of how many dustbins and trash cans you can knock over on your way to school. And then one day I wasn't so lucky anymore. I crashed into 4 parked cars, all cars completely destroyed, including my own. And I won't forget the policeman who came to the scene, who saw me in the car and was like, oh my God, he's still alive. So that idea that I was supposed to be dead, that stuck with me. And, you know, I asked myself all these weird questions. If I would have died, who would have come to my funeral? Who would have actually cared? Was it all worth it? And at that point, I only had depressing answers. So it took me on this intense search for meaning, trying to figure out what is life all about. I started reading a wonderful book that I actually reread last year, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is all about how do we find meaning even in tough situations. And what I realized when kind of being on that journey of exploration back in those days was that what I enjoy doing the most is connecting ideas, connecting people, and the spark that comes from that. And so I started out as community builder, then entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, and later on also in academia. And what I found fascinating on this journey is that the most successful, purpose-driven, inspiring people that I worked with, that I studied, that I somehow collaborate with, they seem to have something in common, which is that they somehow intuitively cultivate serendipity. They intuitively cultivate this smart luck that we'll talk today. And so what I'll talk about today is really, we've been working on this science-based framework for cultivating serendipity that hopefully then also helps us in our daily lives. And so being the German I am, of course, I have a very structured PowerPoint here as well that will come here on screen in a second. By the way, I'm also a big believer that most of the knowledge usually is in the room rather than in the head of the presenter. So if you have anything you want to share in the chat, anything, you know, practices that you're employing to have more of that kind of serendipity, that smart luck happen in your life, in your organizations, or more broadly, how you create an organization and a life that's fit for the future, please do share it with us, and I'll try to pick it up from time to time as I can and integrate that into the conversation. And hopefully at some point we'll all be able to interact in person. I saw the guest list, and it's fantastic and amazing what kind of wonderful people are in the room. So I'm very much looking forward also to continuing this conversation with everyone. So in terms of the journey, we of course face big challenges. We're all very aware of. There's all this kind of individual uncertainty, a lot of people going through personal transitions, professional transitions, both triggered by the current moment, but also more broadly by this fast changing world that we're facing. We see that there's ways of working and living that are not necessarily completely new, but accelerated. We see that there's a lot of intricate and complex societal and environmental challenges. And so life is more often than even in the past shaped by the unexpected. And that is the case in innovation, inventions, in love, in all areas of life. And so developing a muscle for this unexpected becomes crucial, of course. And that's really about this kind of cultivating smart luck, cultivating positive unexpected outcomes. So to be sure, we talk about the same thing when we talk about serendipity, this kind of smart luck. Here's a couple of examples. One here is, if you have erratic hand movements like I do, you spill a lot of coffee. So imagine you spill coffee over someone in a coffee shop, and that person looks at you and they're slightly annoyed, but you sense there might be something there. You don't know what it is. You just sense it might be something there. Now you have two options, right? Option number one is you just say, I'm so sorry, here's a napkin. You walk outside and you think, what could have happened had I spoken with this person? And option number two, you start that conversation and that person turns out to become the love of your life, your co-founder, your business partner, you name it. It's our reaction to that unexpected moment, our making it meaningful, that then essentially creates that kind of serendipitous outcome in the long run. Any ideas what that might be on the upper right? Any ideas, if you want to put in the chat, any ideas what the upper right might be? It's usually a good sign, actually. So this is where a couple of decades ago, some researchers were giving people medication against angina pectoris, and they realized there was some kind of movement happening in male participants' trousers. And what would we usually do in such a moment? We'll probably be like, "Oh my God, that's embarrassing. Let's ignore this. Let's find a better way to cure angina than having that quote unquote side effect." They did the opposite. They said, "You know what? That's unexpected, but there's probably a lot of men in the world who might have a problem in that department. So why don't we?" Exactly to Morgan's point, why don't we develop a medication around this? And that's how Viagra indeed evolved and became one of the most successful medications. Here on the lower right, any ideas what that might be? On the lower, like on the bottom right, any ideas what that might be? Chicken skewer. Any ideas what that might be? So this is a potato washing machine. And so the potato washing machine, a few years ago, a company in China that produces refrigerators and washing machines, one of the leading white goods suppliers in the world, white goods manufacturers in the world, they received calls from farmers. And the farmers told them, your crappy washing machine is always breaking down. Well, why is the washing machine breaking down? Well, we're trying to wash our potatoes in it, and it doesn't seem to work. And what would we usually do? We would probably, quote unquote, try to educate the customer, right? And tell them, well, don't wash your potatoes in this washing machine. It's made for clothes. Well, they did the opposite. They said, you know what? That's unexpected. But there's probably a lot of farmers in China and in the world who might have a similar problem. So why don't we build in a dirt filter and make it a potential, sweet potato washing machine? And that's how the sweet potato washing machine became one of their products. Here on the lower left, you see a recent example where breweries that lost customers, restaurants and others due to the pandemic, they realized, oh wow, maybe we can use our alcohol to produce hand sanitizer. And so they shifted towards becoming hand sanitizer companies. The same with fashion companies, realizing, oh, we could become mass producers and so on. But the point here is, when we look at up to 50% of innovations, social innovations, and more broadly, things in life that somehow have a bigger meaningful impact, it tends to be serendipitous. It tends to be something that emerges unexpectedly in some way, even if we hope that usually we can plan things out. Now, what the fascinating thing is, of all the kind of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples that we studied around the world in very different contexts, a lot of my research, for example, is in sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin America, and then also in the UK and the US. And it's fascinating to see that the stories of serendipity are extremely different, but there's always the same pattern. And the pattern is always that there's some kind of situation, right? Some kind of like trigger that happens in the situation. So there might be movement in male participants' trousers. There might be farmers calling and saying this washing machine is breaking down. There might be COVID happen and the customers kind of like not being available anymore, and so on. It's an unexpected random event that is happening. But then we have to do something with it. We have to imbue meaning in this moment. So we have to connect the dots, see something in that moment. And then a lot of times, actually, we need the tenacity to go through with it. It's not enough to just run into someone at a conference and say, oh my God, such a coincidence, we could do XYZ project together. We actually have to follow through, right? Follow up meetings and so on, so that we then later can say, oh, serendipity happened then. But it's usually, there's a certain incubation time of serendipity a lot of times. And that, of course, is something where tenacity a lot of times comes into play. So the interesting thing about this is that once we look at serendipity as a process and not just as a kind of passive thing that happens to us, right? That's blind luck. Blind luck is being born into a nice family, things that just happen to us passively. But serendipity is really this active process of spotting and connecting dots. And the fascinating thing then is once we see that it's about spotting those dots or even creating those dots and then connecting them, we can influence every step, right? We can create more serendipity triggers, and I'll talk about this when talking about things like the hook strategy. We can learn how to connect the dots better, but also we can build that muscle that makes us more tenacious to actually go through with this. And then, of course, it becomes interesting that we can also develop the organizational enablers that help us to have more of this happen in the organizational context that can do something. The problem, of course, is that a lot of times we might miss serendipity, right? We might not see the trigger, we might not be able to connect the dots, or we might not have the tenacity to go through with it. And that's actually, just to ask you one question here to show you the importance, for example, seeing those potential things out there. I'd love to ask you, do you mind putting in the chat, do you consider yourself to be a lucky or an unlucky person? Just lucky or unlucky. Do you consider yourself to be a lucky or an unlucky person? If you want to put in the chat, lucky or unlucky, or sometimes lucky, or. And the reason I'm asking you this is when we think about the way of how a lot of times unexpected good luck happens is it's because we are open and alert to it. It's because we see it. And so there's wonderful. So I see here a couple of Morgan is an optimist. AD is lucky. Tom is a lucky person. Magdalena lucky. Amy lucky. Rebecca lucky. 81 EK. Both depends. Yeah. Annie's lucky. Jeff's lucky. Melanie lucky. She creates her own luck, or they create their own luck. Chris lucky. Andrew lucky, Andy lucky, Delia lucky, sometimes lucky, Carla lucky, Veronica, both at different life stages. Yeah, there's this time element, and Kate sometimes lucky. So we see a relatively lucky room, and then a couple of unlucky and sometimes lucky people. And so the reason why I'm asking you this is there's a couple of experiments, and some of which kind of more serious than others. But one experiment that I've loved a lot, and that you can replicate in different types of situations, is where they take one person who considers themselves to be very lucky, or they take people who consider themselves to be very lucky and people who consider themselves to be very unlucky, and then they take one of each and say, walk down the street, go into a coffee shop, order a coffee, sit down, and then we'll have our conversation. What they don't tell them is that there's hidden cameras along the street and inside the coffee shop. There's a £5 note, so money, in front of the coffee shop. And then inside the coffee shop, there's this one empty seat next to this extremely successful businessman who can make big dreams happen. Now, the lucky person walks down the street, sees the £5 note, picks it up, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman. They start a conversation, exchange business cards, potentially an opportunity coming out of it. We don't know that part. The unlucky person walks down the street, steps over the 5-pound note, so doesn't see it, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, ignores the businessman, and that's it. Now, at the end of the day, they ask both people, how was your day today? And so the lucky person says, well, it was amazing. I found money in the street, made new friends, and potentially an opportunity coming out of it. The unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And you can replicate that in different situations where you can put people into exactly the same situation, facing exactly the same challenges, and one will just, have very different experiences and than the other. And so the interesting thing about this is, and we can talk more about this later, that talking to the businessman, it obviously helps to kind of engage people to make it more likely that you have those kind of things happen. But for closet introverts like myself, there's a lot of hope that a lot of times unexpected good luck comes from silent and calm sources, right? It might be from walking down the street and looking into the window of a bookstore and thinking, oh my God, this could be a podcast, or things like this, right? Where it comes from calm, quiet sources rather than from the kind of extroversion. But what I wanted to show you with the money piece is I'm finding a lot of money in the street, mostly, unfortunately, pennies. So it's kind of like, it doesn't really add up much to that. But because I expect it to be there, I see it more often because people drop unexpectedly a lot of money. Or they drop a lot of money in the street. The point is, once we have the alertness to something unexpected, we tend to see it more. And that's the same. There's research that has been done in companies where they ask people, look out for surprising incidences. If someone calls up and talks about how the washing machine is used differently, tell us about it. And once people start looking out for it, they start to see it more often. And I'm a big fan of simple things, for example, like in the weekly meeting, ask people, what surprised you last week? And once you do that, it kind of legitimizes the idea that the unexpected happens all the time, but also that it's part of the process. It's not a threat, but rather it's a potential ally. Now, one big question, of course, always before we dive into some of the practices is how do you study this, right? How do you study serendipity? And there's 3 ways that I find particularly interesting and useful. One is through qualitative methods where you look over time. So, for example, one of our studies, we went into an incubator that kind of helps entrepreneurs grow. And then over time, we would observe what happens to entrepreneurs over time. And you would see, for example, that one entrepreneur one day would run into someone unexpectedly. And then 2 days later, they would set up a new app based on the idea they got from that kind of running into the person unexpectedly. And then they shift their business model and go into that direction. So you kind of over time can study how these entrepreneurs kind of unexpectedly so develop new ideas and so on. Another approach is kind of looking at counterfactuals. So looking at what could have happened. So for example, there's this rabbit ear example where a couple of decades ago, 2 researchers at the same time gave rabbits injections and they tried to figure out something and they gave them injections with papaya and they saw that the rabbit's ears flopped. And that was very unexpected to both of them. Both found it unexpected, but only one of them actually followed up on it and then realized, oh my God, that has to do with blood flow and all these kind of different things. And that ended up to become kind of prize-winning arthritis medication that came out of this, whereas the other one didn't really follow up. And so what we can do here is we can look at 2 incidences that were unexpected, or the same incidence that's unexpected, but then how does someone act based on that incidence and look at that counterfactual? So what would have happened had they done that, or comparing to others that are going with. And then the third one that I find very interesting is these kind of social experiments where you literally just do exactly what I mentioned earlier. You put people into different situations and see how they react to unexpected cues. For example, in newspapers, having people read through a newspaper and then kind of like building in unexpected cues, and some of them will see them and others will not. But long story short, that's kind of like a couple of ways of how we study it. But of course, the much more interesting thing is how do we have more of this, right? How do we create more of this? And what holds us back from it? And so some of the things that hold us back is really biases and self-limiting constraints, right? So we tend to underestimate how likely the unexpected is. Those of you interested, there's this amazing birthday paradox. If we were sitting together in a room, we could play that out now. But the idea is that in a room of 23 people, I'd love you actually to think about what do you think is the probability, and if you want to put that in the chat, the probability of 23 people in the same room that 2 people have the same birthday. What do you think is the probability in a room of 23 people that 2 people have the same birthday? So February 22nd, so like the day and the month. So no specific date, but the day of the month that there's a birthday pair. What do you think is the probability of that? Any takers? So the natural way, of course, would be to say, hey, it's 365 days in the year. It's 23 people. You divide that by each other, and you come up with a very low probability, right? That there's something like this happen. Lewis says 1 in 10. So very low probability, right? That we usually would assume is happened. But actually, the probability is 50%. And then when you have 70, 80, 90 people, it's almost 100%, 99% when you go towards 70, 80, 90. And that's incredible, right? That it is extremely probable that in a room of 70, 80, 90 people, you have 2 people who have the same birthday. And the reason is that it's not a linear kind of function, but an exponential function, in the sense that if Chris has 22 people in the room who could have their birthday, Annie still has 21 people, then the next one still has 20, given if they didn't have the same birthday yet. And so essentially the idea is that you have so many potential pairs that could be there, that is to the power of something. The long story short is really to say that actually it is extremely likely that in a room of 50, 60, 70 people, 2 people have the same birthday. And that's unexpected, right? Because we would usually assume it's extremely unlikely. Those of you who are interested in that, if you Google the birthday paradox, it'll show you that distribution. But it's just fascinating to see that, that's also how we tend to approach life, right? To think that we know the variables, that you can plan things out, that you can organize things step by step. It's a linear approach to life, but actually life is exponential in a way, right? That you have all these possible things that could happen, even in this presentation now, right? It's very unlikely that I throw off my laptop here. It's very unlikely that the coffee sips on it. It's very unlikely that like my wife comes in with our a cute little newborn and they kind of scream at me. All of these things are extremely unlikely. But if you add them up, it becomes actually relatively likely that something unexpected happens. And so that's the interesting thing in life, that we tend to see more serendipity once we realize that the positively unexpected is everywhere, if we see it or not. Another thing that holds us back is functional fixedness, the hammer nail problem, right? If we have a particular approach, a particular hammer, you put if you have a hammer and you need a nail in the wall, you essentially will always look for the hammer to get the nail to the wall. So you always will use your one approach, versus if you haven't been used to the hammer, you might use any heavy object to get that nail into the wall and do that. And then the last kind of potential self-limiting bias that sometimes holds us back is post-rationalization. I work a lot with executive teams, and if you're the CEO of a company and you go into a boardroom, what you want to say is obviously, this was my plan, this is exactly what we did, and then exactly this happened, right? So you want to portray control at all times. You want to show that you were the one who led the company. But that's, of course, not how it tends to happen. And what we see here is, similar to how we would probably present our CV, we would say it linearly, right? We did this, then we did this, then we did this. But the actual experience, of course, is much more like a squiggle. It's much more like this. Even if we then tell it again as if it is step by step. And so what I found fascinating in our research is we, for example, did a study recently with over 40 of the world's leading CEOs that have been purpose-driven and that have tried to bring their companies more towards impact. When you take a company like MasterCard, for example, that traditionally has been very kind of focused on financial transactions and so on, and now says, well, can we be part of tackling some bigger global challenges? Can we be part of bringing 500 million people into the financial system? Those kind of companies, when you look at them, how their CEOs have been operating, a lot of times you would see that they are not focused on this kind of illusion of control of, I have to control every step, but rather there will be this kind of idea of, here's a sense of direction, here's a sense of where we're going. We want to get 500 million people into the financial system. Here's an approximate strategy, but I'm telling you already now that I need you to identify the unexpectedly emerging kind of interesting things that will help us to exactly go where we want to get to. And so they price in the idea that the unexpected will happen. And what happens then is that the unexpected isn't a threat to their authority, but actually becomes part of their plan. And that's, of course, also much more credible to their staff and their people who say yes, like they don't kind of pretend that they have it all figured out, but actually they are building a good culture that allows to cultivate serendipity. And how they do that, I'll talk about in a second. But the key point being, it's really kind of legitimizing this idea that the unexpected happens all the time, and that's just there. Here's a bit of, if you have any favorite serendipity practices, please do share in the chat. Always very interesting. Now, a couple of practices. One on how we can actually cultivate serendipity. One of my favorites is the hook strategy. The hook strategy, Ollie Barrett, a wonderful entrepreneur in London, is extremely good at this. If you would ask him something like, what do you do? You know, this dreaded question that we all get at conferences and you name it. He wouldn't just say, I'm a technology entrepreneur. He would say something like, I'm a technology entrepreneur, recently read into the philosophy of science, but what I'm really interested in is playing the piano. And so what he's doing here is he's giving you 3 potential hooks where you could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. My sister is teaching on the philosophy of science. You should give a guest lecture. Oh my God, such a coincidence. We've been hosting piano matinees. You should stop by. The point is that we can use every interaction to cast a couple of interesting themes that we're interested in, and then let the other person connect the dots for us. So I'm a big fan of doing a serendipity journal where you just write down what are 2 or 3 key themes that I'm interested in at the moment, and can I just seed that into conversation with my colleagues, with my aunt, with my uncle, you name it, and then those kind of unexpected things come from the most unexpected of places. Another one, of course, is asking questions differently. Instead of asking the dreaded "what do you do" question, asking something like, what do you enjoy doing? So if you would, imagine you're in a fishing village somewhere in Italy, and you ask the person who's fishing, well, what do you do? She will say, well, I'm a fisherwoman. But if you ask them, what do you enjoy about fishing? They will say, well, I enjoy the endlessness of the sea, or you name it. And then you find that unexpected denominator where you say, oh my God, yes, like I love the endlessness of philosophy, or you name it. Another one is really looking at mistakes and crisis differently. We can talk about this later. There's things such as the project funeral, where it's about saying, how do we celebrate the learning from what didn't work? And by doing this, we allow people to, kind of talk about the things that don't work also, because in companies, we tend to celebrate success, but of course, there's much more to learn from the things that didn't work, but usually people hide them away. So there's all these practices we can use to essentially allow people to put projects to rest, to celebrate the learning from that. And that's where a lot of times unexpected kind of new ideas emerge. Reframing situations is a big one. I'm a big fan. If you look at companies like Philips, for example, for a long time, they were organized kind of in departments that would have names such as tomography department. And if you organize a department based on the solution, like tomography, that of course constrains the thinking of people, right? So now I'm always thinking, how do I make a better tomography product? Rather than if it would be a department called precision diagnosis, you would think about other ways. And then tomography might be one solution, but there might be 50 others that you might think of to come up with. So it's about not over-defining the challenge, not over-defining the problem, but actually giving people the space to think about these things more broadly. There's a lot of work coming out of low-income contexts we can talk about, if that's of interest to some of you, of how we can make the best out of what is at hand. And by doing this, in a way, kind of reframe our thinking away from resource constraints to the idea that a lot of times there's abundance in the moment. Another practice before then wrapping up and going into the Q&A is the idea of really kind of the surprise focus in every process and procedure. Nobody really loves, change. Everyone talks about innovation and so on, but obviously nobody really likes it when they are part of the ones that are being changed or innovated. And so I'm a big fan of not pushing everything at once, but really saying, how do we build in small things, like asking people what surprised you last week and so on, but then also investing into those unexpected emerging ideas that come up. And last but not least, then leveraging technology and space design, especially also virtually. I had a wonderful conversation with Celia earlier about how at Nesta and other organizations, there's been these wonderful ideas around random lunches, randomized coffee trials and so on, where you essentially take people across the organization and match them randomly for a quick coffee. In some organizations, they get an inspiring prompt like, what's your challenge and how can I support you? And if you do that across different levels of the hierarchy and across different departments, what you're doing is you're recreating these water cooler moments that have been taken off the table by the pandemic a lot. And it's great for serendipity, but it's also great for the sense of belonging towards the company or the organization that a lot of times has been taken away from this. And I talked about the North Star or key curiosity that, of course, helps us to connect those dots. Now, there's a lot of implications for policymaking. I'm sure Celia will talk about this later, really kind of focusing more on bridging between different communities rather than doing it in some local ones. But I want to kind of wrap it up by saying, nobody likes change too much. So this is about kind of a lot of times doing practices after and after rather than throwing it all at once. It's about normalizing imperfection. It's about saying, hey, look, even the most amazing CEOs in the world, a lot of times are just, winging it. And there's a lot around role modeling there. How do we open meetings, for example, with the idea that, hey, like at the beginning, a lot of ideas are not, there yet. It's about acknowledging the anxiety that we all have when things change. And I think that's a very human thing that is there. Making space for things like meditation so that really kind of anchor us a little more, and taking the long view. I mean, serendipity a lot of times has inflection points that come out of crises, and then the crisis itself becomes that kind of beautiful inflection point for something much bigger. And that really leads me to the final quote. And by the way, the books here, wherever you are in the world, my editor tells me to mention that there's these different versions, the two serendipity mindset versions and then the paperback version. But it really kind of leads back to, I grew up in Heidelberg where, Goethe and Schiller wrote their poems. And Goethe had this beautiful idea that if you take someone as they are, you make them worse. But if you take them as who they could be, you make them capable of becoming what they can be. And that's what serendipity is all about, right? Serendipity is about potentiality. It's about what could be. And us as leaders or as people, parents or others who are with people whom they want to lift up, there's so much about saying, how do I enable people to have that potentiality happen in their life? And that's why I'm so excited about this work, because I feel it can really propel towards potentiality, especially during a time that's so heavy as it is at the moment. And so I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. For now, handing back to Celia.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that tour, Christian. And I feel like with so many lucky people in the chat, we should pick some lottery numbers or something, make the most of it. So do put your questions in the chat while I'm talking to Christian. I'll start to come to those in a minute. But before then, I'm going to capitalize on the role of chair, just to ask a few of my own that struck me as I was reading the book. I think what's one of the things, and you talked towards the end there about some of the approaches for creating smart luck, and a lot of those sort of tactics come much more easily to extroverts, like speaking to strangers. And I realized when reading your book that the pandemic has made these kinds of behaviors feel far more challenging to us. We feel tired, we feel fatigued if we were ever extrovert enough to actually do them in the first place. So do you think that given that fatigue, we're actually less likely to pursue those serendipitous opportunities? And how do we adapt in a context of remote working? I think there was a specific question in the chat from Thomas Ruddy about virtual brainstorming. So that would be one place to start.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think we all resonate with the idea that the kind of whole working at home completely has been taking away a lot of the kind of social interaction, but also the energy that comes from that, right? I mean, there is a lot of fatigue, I think, especially always sitting with the same people, right? I mean, we think we coordinate with so many people, but it's mostly the same people, right? So it's actually quite few people with whom we constantly engage with. And so I think that is a given. And what I've always liked is the idea of Zoom or WebEx being our personal private plane, right? I can now fly into Celia's living room. I can talk with her about the books on her shelf behind her. I can see her cat like running behind her, or her toddler, coming into the midst of it, or those kind of things where we can connect very differently now because I become directly part of her kind of living space. And to me, that actually, when we really kind of reframe that situation away from, okay, everything has been taken away, to, okay, there's a couple of things here actually that can really help us in terms of how we converse. The pandemic has, led to a lot of anxiety in everyone. I've never met anyone who, after the third glass of red wine, wouldn't admit that they had a lot of anxiety through all of this, right? I mean, I just had a newborn, and her grandparents couldn't see her for months because literally the borders were closed. I could have never imagined that, like that just was just be taken away from us like this. And so these things cause anxiety. And so that anxiety, though, is a beautiful common denominator for all of us to communicate, right? To say, hey, how did you survive this? How did you go through this? Like, this is kind of, in a way, I think we can have very different conversations now because we have a common denominator that is probably the most global common denominator we've ever had in our lifetime. There's nothing else that has ever brought people so into the same conversation in that sense and gives such a common denominator. And I think thirdly, I think in general, and the private plane metaphor really being about, when you think about something like me now, when you launch a book into a pandemic, right? The hardcover was launched into a pandemic. And we first thought, oh my God, okay, now all the bookstores are closed, all the airport stores are closed. And we were really depressed about it. We were like, geez, that really is not the nicest thing. But then we realized, hey, now we can actually take it much more global, because now you can be in Costa Rica in the morning, and then you can directly be in Tokyo the hour after. And so in a way, you don't have to go through customs and have to fly somewhere and have to do this, but you can scale an idea directly. And I think that kind of scale element of directly being able to take something into different contexts that immediately, I think I've seen that with different businesses. I've seen that with others where it's just more accepted now to do that in those different ways. So my long story short is, I think there's things that have changed, right? And where we all have to kind of adjust to. But also, I think a lot of the times, the things we talk about, right? The way we ask questions and things like this, we can also do that on Zoom, right? I feel like, Celia, we had a wonderful conversation. We touched everything from our kids to the pandemic to that we both had COVID to that, and I feel like you can do that as well. So long story short, I think there's a lot of these kind of barriers, but also I think a lot of opportunity in that kind of shift.
Well, it doesn't surprise me you've got a glass half full approach to this, Christian. You mentioned in the book a lot of accidental breakthroughs, which are kind of part of the canon of innovation. So, the story of Post-it notes and 3mm and penicillin. So almost like solutions which present themselves to problems we weren't actually trying to solve or didn't know we were trying to solve in the first place. But it's actually capitalizing on these sparks that's important. And I don't think you use this story in your book, but I think the example of Kodak is quite a revealing one. And everyone knows that Kodak went bankrupt, and it's this example of a dinosaur which failed to innovate in the digital age. But it's less well known that a Kodak engineer actually invented the first digital camera in the 1970s, and then the company failed to do anything with that patent. So what I loved in your book was that you've got a phrase for this issue, absorptive capacity. So the ability to absorb those different approaches and then do something with it. And I think we had someone in the chat, Dim was talking about uncertainty as being one of the key conditions for innovation. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about how organizations get better, not just about generating those ideas, but then doing something with them. Yeah,
that's a really interesting idea. And I think that kind of absorptive capacity, so the ability to spot a potential idea, but then also to actually do something with it, to quote unquote, for the lack of a better term, exploit that idea and do something with it. Being really crucial in this time, because there's nothing worse, right, to say in a company, yeah, we're all about ideas, and then whenever someone comes up with an idea, they're not being heard. Like that's really demotivating. Then I'd rather not even have brought in the idea in the first place. And so it's kind of things where, if you look at a company like Hire, this Chinese company that I mentioned earlier, what they have is they develop this quote unquote ecosystem where whenever an interesting idea comes up, there's an informal investment committee that directly can invest into it. And I think it's kind of those things where, when you look at companies like Pixar, you have a informal brain trust, right? Of people who say, okay, this idea could work, this idea couldn't. But so a very simple approach where you can say, when ideas come up, we have a mechanism that we do something with them. No matter what we do them, people respect when their ideas are not taken in, but they want to be listened to, right? And I think that's kind of the main thing that there's a lot of research around all these kind of sourcing of ideas things. And people don't have an idea if they don't win, but they have a problem with, I didn't even get a notification if my idea was somehow involved in something or not, and those kind of things. And so I think the most important thing when it comes to that absorptive capacity being saying, hey, what is a process, an easy process that when someone comes up with a potato washing machine idea, here's a place to put it, and here's a very easy way for us to potentially invest into it, and to understand what do we want to invest in. And I always like the Pixar approach of a very kind of simple, informal brain trust, an informal advisory board that says this works, that doesn't work. I've seen that with people individually, where people say, these are my two people. Whenever a new idea comes up, I quickly check with them. And then if it doesn't work, importantly, not killing the idea, but having a parking lot, right? So saying, here's a, I mean, it used to be wiki page in the days, now it's probably a Google Sheet or so, but literally just storing those kind of ideas and saying, okay, hey, like here, these are the things we can't work on at the moment, but we'll work on later on. And I think I've seen it, especially in the startup context, where yes, there's so many potential opportunities, but you got to focus on some of them. And so putting the rest on a parking lot being really effective. And then I think the third aspect, which I think is the most important one, is to I think a lot of times people think about innovation, those kind of things, isolatedly from the rest of the organization, right? So there's people who are like responsible for, like, it's the old R&D mindset where some people are responsible for coming up with new ideas. That doesn't work in the world we live in, right? Like in the world we live in, like ideas have to come from everywhere, from the salesperson who interacts with the farmer to other people. And so it's really this idea of building the culture around it. And that's what I'm most fascinated by, to say, can you build the culture by doing very small things? Like when you have the performance review, build in one more question around what surprised you and how can we help you make that happen? Or when you promote people, can you not only promote based on XYZ sales numbers or something, but also based on, you know, how did they kind of spot new opportunities or things like this? So really the idea of how do we integrate that into every process rather than have kind of this isolated ideas, a process for something.
That so resonates for us, Christian. We talk in our team and at Nesta about having a culture of distributed discovery. So, you know, we might have a discovery team, but actually everyone around the organization plays this critical role in sensing for new ideas and helping us make sense of those signals. So the idea that it's siloed in one team is, you know, it's just not how this stuff works. And there's a lovely comment from Andy, who's putting down his own luck to an innate curiosity that he has in other people, towards other people. And I think curiosity actually underpins almost all of the stories of serendipity in your book. But my question is, are we perhaps experiencing a bit of a dearth of curiosity when it comes to people who hold different opinions? Do you think there's a link between that and these kind of toxic kind of culture wars that we're in? We're getting less and less curious and actually a bit more sort of tribal almost online.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, and thank you so much, Andy. That's such a fantastic point, because if you think about it, where do a lot of these kind of, you know, culture war and things come from? It's because people want to believe in something, right? They like, you want some kind of anchor for what you can believe in when the whole world seems to be kind of like falling apart, and when you feel maybe you were discriminated against or other means. And so I think it's kind of this, like, what is something that I can hold on to? And I think unfortunately a lot of times that is being abused by political leaders who then kind of, you know, shape some narratives where people buy into and kind of, it gives them a certain idea of, okay, at least there's something here I can believe in. But I think to me that really kind of, you know, that question of, and that's why I've been focusing so much on this question of common denominator, because I think once you kind of step out of these kind of debates of things and stuff like that, you realize a lot of times, you know, like, it's not my place to wade into too many of the UK or other debates at the moment, but I think it's kind of, you realize at the end of the day, we have a lot in common, but also there's a couple of things that in a way people have an incentive to just kind of tear people apart. And I think by, in a way, curiosity is the one vehicle, right, that allows us to say, if you're a fisherwoman, we still have a lot in common. We still probably long for the far away, or we still long for whatever it is. And by asking someone slightly different questions, instead of what party are you in? Are you Conservative or Labour or whatever it is? If we ask more about, like, you know, what is it about that made you join in the first place? Or is that, and then they might say, well, I joined in the first place because I just want my kids to be protected. And then you're like, yeah, no, I can resonate with this. Like, we actually want the same thing. We just voted different parties because we believe that one of them does it better. And so I think it's really kind of this idea of once we let go of these kind of boxes of, you're in this party, you're in this party, you're in this job, you're in this job, and really step back and say, well, why did you go there in the first place? And what was it about this there's actually a lot we relate to each other, and we might be surprised about those kind of things. And I'm a big fan of a book that I reread every couple of years, which is The Little Prince. And the Little Prince book, it's so much about the idea that you constantly question everything, right? And you constantly ask why. And you know, there's this kind of one story or sub-story where the little prince goes to this guy who counts stars. And so the little prince asks the guy, like, why are you counting all these stars? And he's like, well, I'm counting the stars so that I, you know, can then buy more stars. And then he's like, yeah, but then what? And then he's like, well, then I can count more and buy more and count more and buy more. And the little prince is like, well, but what's the point? Like, what's the point of all of this? And I think, to me, this is like one of the, there's a lot of bad things to the pandemic, but I think one of the interesting things that I think leaders, the opportunity leaders have in this pandemic is to say, okay, people are looking for orientation. People are looking for a redefinition of success. Maybe it's not about counting how many stars you have there or how many cars you have in your garage or whatever it is, but maybe there's like a deeper meaning we're longing for. And maybe as a leader, I can provide this. And I think that's why we've seen, you know, when you look at some companies that have really stepped up, those are the kind of people where in 10 years, people will say, this person really stepped up during that period, versus others who really failed and just cut costs and did that. And I think, you know, in one of our studies, Hubert Joly said it nicely, who used to be the CEO at Best Buy. He said something along the lines of, look, the unexpected, like you can see the people who are real leaders versus the ones who kind of like are not real leaders, and people will remember that in 10 years. Like people will remember if you were the one who just kind of like dismissed 10 people out of the office, or if you were the one who really helped them through that period. And I think that's what those periods are. The opportunity of those periods is to, in a way, also show your true colors.
To discover meaning. And I agree with you. There is great wisdom in children's books. There's a question from Greta in the chat, and she talks about tenacity, and the role of tenacity in all of this. What practices can we cultivate, which mean that we don't give up on particular opportunities? And I know that you're really interested in this because it comes up in your book in the guise of grit, which is something you know, lots of us in policymaking circles are interested in, and resilience. So could you say a bit more about that theme?
Yeah. Thanks so much, Greta. That's a really interesting question, and I think, you know, when you think about serendipity, a lot of times you might have this thing where you might have bumped into someone 5 years ago, and then now you read a book and you're like, oh my God, that person I met 5 years ago, they talked about this. Maybe now it's the time we can finally start that company. And that's the first step, right? That's the thought. But then now actually starting the company, doing this, going through the motions, that's exactly the kind of tenacity / grit part. And also in our personal lives, right? Like it's not enough to just bump into the potential like love of our life. We have to go on dates, we have to charm them and so on. So it's kind of, it is a process, right, of doing this. And I think it's toughest, of course, in situations of crises, right? Because a lot of times when we think about what we talked about, serendipity can come out of like beautiful moments, but a lot of times it comes out of crises, right? It comes out of accidents. It comes out of, in the case of Viagra, kind of things that go wrong, or at least kind of that it could be perceived as going wrong. And I think the interesting thing there is two things that I found really useful is, one is to take the long view. So to always think about in every situation, does this really matter in 5 years from now? Like, is that kind of like, now that, you know, I spilled that glass on the floor, and yes, it really is bad that this will cost money, but in 5 years from now, will I even remember this? I don't think so. So will I be too worried about that incident? Probably not. Versus there's a couple of, you know, as a parent now, I'm realizing, you know, how many high consequence decisions there are with a kid, right? Like, and so I think it's kind of, that as a metric has helped me a lot to say, okay, what's the long view perspective here? And then realizing that a lot of these things that go wrong could be an inflection point for something even better. A breakup in a relationship might be the one door that needed to be opened for the real person to come in, and things like this. So I think that kind of reframing has helped me a lot to reframe the situation and try to find one meaningful thing in there. And I'll talk about this in 1 second about Viktor Frankl, because I think that it wraps it up. But the second point that I think is more interesting in that regard is there's a lot to learn, I think, from Adam Grant and others who have been looking into the question of perseverance, grits, and one practice that they do, I think he learned that from Sheryl Sandberg when she lost her husband, and they had a lot of conversations around this. And one of the things that was kind of at the core was to say, how do I take myself out of situations? So how do I if I am in a particular emotional situation, how do I now, for example, what is the advice I would give a friend of mine? And that kind of like lets us go out of this kind of system one, oh my God, everything is kind of chaos, to system two, oh, actually, hey, maybe there's something I can do about this situation. Maybe there's something I can control versus just the uncontrollable stuff that's happening here. And so I'm a big fan of this idea of, similar to how we do it with kids, right? That we ask kids, right, what would you do, versus like just giving them the advice when they are in a crisis. And doing the same thing, I think that gives us a lot of times this kind of ability to then pull through, because we're like, okay, it might not be as bad as we thought. I think there's a lot of other practices. For the sake of time, I just wanted to wrap it up with Viktor Frankl, because I feel like he speaks a lot to the first point in terms of how do we find grit and tenacity in the toughest of situations. Because I think we all have seen really tough times at the moment, and some even more than others, right? I think the pandemic has exacerbated societal inequality, and I think that's, by the way, a point we could probably talk about. There's very different starting positions for people when it comes to serendipity based on their societal background. But Viktor Frankl, essentially, what I found fascinating about him is that even when there was objectively no meaning in a moment, he would create a meaning. So he was in a concentration camp, which is the toughest of situations you can imagine, where every day you might die. There's no hope. Like objectively, there's no hope. And he still said, look, every day now I will talk with another fellow prisoner and make them feel better. And now I have a reason to wake up tomorrow morning. Now I created a meaning of still wanting to live. And I think that's kind of the interesting thing, that in every moment there's still some kind of meaning we can create, even if there isn't an objective meaning to it. And I think that's what serendipity a lot of times is about, making accidents meaningful.
Really fascinating. And on this theme of, I guess, grit or resilience, if I were to play devil's advocate for a second, Christian, it would be possible to say that the idea of making your own luck has something in common with philosophies of, rugged individualism, and that it could even actually minimize, the structural disadvantage that we know most people face. So do you think that serendipity, given it's often about recognizing commonalities, can actually have a multiplying effect for groups who have the edge in terms of the advantages that life has afforded them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's two elements to it. One is a structural one, and one is an individual. And on the structural side, there's, we have very different starting positions in life. I mean, when I work with a social entrepreneur who's in the Cape Flats in Cape Town, who doesn't have access to education, who doesn't have access to networks and so on, very different starting position to me here now in the West Village in New York, where, there's education, there's access to networks and so on. And so very different starting positions. And then to your point, like it kind of multiplies in the sense of, it's almost like interest on the bank, right? The better your starting position at the beginning, the more likely that more of that will happen. And so this is why I'm a big fan on the structural side. We do a lot of work with policymakers around how do you create ecosystems for that, especially for those people who are less privileged. So for example, if you think about scholarships to kids from less privileged backgrounds, it's not just about the scholarship. You can put a kid into an amazing school, but if they then, after getting out of school, don't get a job because they don't have the connections that the others have, then you only did part of your job. And so it's really about saying, how do I then directly put 3 mentors that are kind of working with them with it, or whatever it is, how do you create an ecosystem that actually levels the playing field more and more and puts them into a good starting position? I think I'm a big fan there of really thinking about linking social capital. So the idea of how do you not over-focus on particular groups themselves, but rather say, if you have groups that are impoverished, for example, and groups that are kind of extremely well off, how do you make sure that there's cross-mentorship both ways, by the way? There's a lot to learn, I think, from people who are in tough contexts. And that's a lot of our focus, actually reverse mentoring and saying there's so much more to learn a lot of times from someone who grew up in a challenging environment for someone who didn't than the other way around. And so I think there's a lot there. So the long story short really is, I think there's a lot around kind of policies for that linking capital. But one thing that I think to me is at the core of this work, and I think this was, to me, the biggest mindset shift was around 10 years ago when I started working in Sub-Saharan Africa. I went into the context and I said, I asked the people I worked there, what is the one question I should never ask you as the person who comes into your context here? And the answer was, never ask us first what we need. Because if you ask us what we need as the first question, you put us into the role of the victim, the beneficiary, someone who kind of needs your benevolence, versus if you come in and say, hey, what can we do together? Like, is there something, we can work on together? Then you can still afterwards think about resourcing, but now it's about us starting out and as equal partners. And to me, that really struck, because I think a lot of the development efforts over the last decades have focused on quote unquote lower needs, right? Give people a bit of food, give them a bit of education and this and this. But actually what people are longing for is to create their own luck. Like, I want to, when I'm the father of a girl or a boy or someone in the Cape Trust in Cape Town, I don't want the UN to kind of cross-subsidize me and make me feel like I failed raising my kids myself. I want to have a job where I can do that myself. And so it's really kind of, I think, a lot of this focus on giving people resources has focused on, like, has disempowered people, versus a lot of the focus of this work is to say, how do you enable people to create their own smart luck? And so the reason I'm bringing this up here is that I think, to your question, there's the structural question where societal inequality potentially exacerbates some of the things we talked about. But at the same time, the mindset piece and the piece of how people can create their own luck is especially important in those contexts. And I've seen this in our own research. Those people who have that kind of mindset going about it, like creating their own luck, and then government coming in and supporting them doing that, that's where the real change happens. That's where hope comes in. That's where people get excited, versus kind of like, people being left behind because they just get thrown money at, but nothing really happens in terms of what they feel they can create on their own.
I'm just going to try and squeeze in one really quick question if I can, because Wim has a really interesting question on LinkedIn about whether or not actually embracing complexity might be a better approach rather than focusing just on the problem. And I know you're really interested in this, because in the book, it's sort of contrary to a lot of the research and approaches on innovation, which really focus on specifying the problem. But you say that actually over specifying the problem prevents us accessing unexpected solutions. So I just wanted to say a couple of quick things on that for Wim's question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wim. It's a great one. And I think that's a balance that's extremely tough to get, right? This balance between time versus openness to opportunity. So that's, in a way, how do we define focus time versus kind of the openness to it? I'm a big believer in this kind of life cycle idea, right? That, like, for example, when you write a book, right? At the beginning, you're super open to serendipity. Yay, give me more ideas. And then you're hiding in the basement and just write it down and get it done because you have to execute, right? That's a lot of times how you do it also in startups and other settings, right? That you might have an explorative phase where serendipity is you want a lot of it, and then you have the execution where you say, okay, a bit less now, please. But I think in general, to Celia's point, where it gets really interesting, there's really interesting research, those of you interested, by von Hippel and von Krock around the idea of how do you create opportunity spaces where essentially you don't over-define a problem or a solution, because that keeps you from actually coming up with different ideas. So, for example, I mean, that's of course the case, especially when it comes to social and environmental issues that are so complex that we can't really know everything. And so we have to rubber stamp a lot of times, but also then with very kind of trivial things, right? So, for example, if I'm the manager of someone and I say, we have to cut costs, now they will focus on cost cutting, right? Now they will think about, how do I produce this cheaper and this cheaper? Versus if I tell them we have to become more profitable, or we have to, in a way, do something about our financial situation, they might also think about how to get more revenue. They might also think how to maybe increase the price, because that might be a better positioning for the product and bring more money. And so the point is, depending on how we define the problem and the potential space that people can operate in, we either kind of cut them or we open it up. And I think especially with societal problems, oversimplifying things a lot of times leads to unintended consequences. And I think I'm a big fan to not focus too much on outputs, but more on figuring out what is the outcomes we really want to achieve, and then kind of develop around this. And I guess that's a whole conversation in itself.
There are so many threads to pick up, and so many interesting comments in the chat that we just haven't had time to get into. But thank you so much, Christian. That was so illuminating. I know I'm probably going to behave a little bit differently, or at least keep my eyes open for £10 notes lying around. Thank you everyone for joining us today and for your brilliant questions. You're about to see a link shared in the chat for your feedback on the event. Tell us what you think and what you'd like to hear more of in the future. Take a look also at our upcoming event with Margaret Heffernan if you like this conversation. She's going to be talking to us about her work on uncertainty and leadership blind spots. Have a great afternoon. Thank you again, Christian, and goodbye.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.